Support provided by Walters, Papillon, Thomas Cullins, LLC, specializing in business litigation and personal injury cases for over 40 years.
Thank you very much for that very nice introduction. When my sister Carol read that someone in the Wall Street Journal had called me the Picasso of election analysis, she asked me if I was going through, isn't that the guy that painted a breast on a knee, and asked me if I was going through my blue period yet. But anyway, thank you very much. Thank you, Barry, for the invitation to come. First, I want to congratulate Governor Blanco and thank her for her incredible service to our state, all the way up the ladder as governor and after you left the governor's office. Your incredible service. It's really inspiring. This morning I was driving up from the New Orleans airport and listening to President Bush's funeral service, and it was just incredibly moving. And for those of you who didn't get a chance to watch or listen, I suggest hopefully you can see a replay of it on C-SPAN or someplace tonight or this weekend, because it really was quite moving. And listening to it, I just felt incredibly grateful, for his life, for his service to our country, for his presidency. And I think you can safely say that no president was ever better prepared, certainly in the foreign policy area, than he was, and no more decent person ever served in the Oval Office. And I was really glad I'd gotten a chance to read John Meacham's wonderful book, Destiny and Power, and Meacham was one of the eulogists this morning, that just really gave you a sense of who this man was and why he was the way he was. Just a terrific book. And it's just really unusual for a figure of the stature of President Bush to ask a biographer to be one of the eulogizers, but he was. And I was really grateful I'd had a chance yesterday afternoon to go by the Capitol building and pay my respects. And I was envious that my son, Jeffrey, who's a young journalist at ABC News, is there covering the funeral. And it's like, wow, I'd like to have been there. But anyway, thank you all for everything you do for our state. Sometimes I say, though, I'm actually not from Louisiana, I'm from Shreveport, which is sort of a, depending upon your point of view, an extension of either Texas or Arkansas, but anyway, but a proud Louisianian. And listening to Governor Blanco, I was thinking about education and the role of teachers, and I think most people can look back, most of us could look back at and pinpoint a half dozen teachers that we had that really made a difference, or one maybe that may have sort of changed the trajectory of our lives. And for me, it was Jack Bogan, a debate coach at Captain Shreve High, who, I don't know what the hell I'd be doing right now if it wasn't for him, but I'm sure he sent me going on this way. Now let's talk about the election. I'm sorry we have nothing to talk about. I'm just going to make some stuff up. But, one of the unusual things about people now, and particularly when they think about politics, is they tend to think of things in a binary way. Something is either gigantic and historic, or it's tiny and inconsequential. And they tend to look at elections that way. And I did a cable show a couple weeks ago, and the host was a pretty liberal guy. And he was talking about this historic election that we just had that was a massive repudiation of President Trump, and that this was the biggest Democratic gain in 44 years, since 1974. And, I was thinking, well, midterm elections are a referendum on incumbent presidents, and it was a pretty good sized gain, but picking up 40 seats That's a good number. It's not as big as the 54 seats that Republicans picked up in 1994, President Clinton's first-term midterm election, the Newt Gingrich tidal wave election. And it wasn't as many seats as Republicans picked up in 2010, President Obama's first-term midterm election, when Republicans picked up 63 seats. But it is the biggest Democratic gain in 44 years. So there was a tendency on that side to overstate it. But on the other hand, I've heard people say, well, it really wasn't a wave at all. It was really more of a ripple. Well, I'm sorry, but when a party loses the national popular vote by 8 percentage points, when a party loses 40 seats and control of the House, and keep in mind that the House has only flipped 4 times in the last 64 years, when a party loses 4 congressional seats just in Orange County, California, or as many as the other party lost in all 50 states combined, and losing suburban districts outside of Dallas and Houston and Chicago and Minneapolis and places like that, and no longer has a House seat in the entire region of New England, okay, that's more than a ripple. And it may not be a tidal wave, it may not be a tsunami, and it wasn't. But it was bigger than a ripple. So this was an election that was something in between, a wave, but just not a gigantic wave. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the 2020 election, but first talk just for a couple of minutes about what happened this year. And if you think about it, what did we know at the outset of this year? We knew that midterm elections are almost invariably they're referenda on incumbent presidents, and it doesn't matter whether that president's a Democrat or Republican. Upwards of 90% of midterm elections, whichever party happens to be occupying the White House, loses seats in the House of Representatives. They 90+% of the time, 90+% of the time, they lose seats in lose governorships in that cycle. In fact, they even lose state legislative seats in that cycle, and you wouldn't think that there would be much of a connection there. And in state legislative is an average of 375 seats nationwide. Now, why does that happen? Well, political scientists will tell us that there are all kinds of reasons why, but to me, the one reason that sticks out more than any other is, if you think about it, let's say your party or the candidate that you supported gets elected president 2 years earlier. What might your emotions be? You might be happy, you might be satisfied, you might be complacent, you might be disappointed, but those are sort of the general range of emotions. But let's say the other side won, and let's say it's a president that you really don't like. What are your emotions? Chances are you're angry, or you're afraid, or to use a phrase that my mother used to say all the time, have their noses out of joint. And no civics teacher is ever going to tell you this, but the two strongest emotions in American politics are hate and fear. It's sad, it's unfortunate, no teacher's ever going to tell you that, but it's really, really true. If I were running for office, I would much rather have voters hate my opponent than love me, because that's a greater motivator. So I think that it's because you see on average about a third fewer people vote in midterm elections than presidential elections, it matters who votes and who is more motivated. Now this year, this election cycle, I had sort of 2 metaphors in mind that in my mind just kind of described what this election was all about. And the first metaphor was that you had what appeared to be a blue Democratic wave up against a red Republican seawall. And the question was going to be, which was going to be stronger, the wave or the wall? Now, what am I talking about? Well, the wave would be midterm election patterns, and 2, the national political environment. And when a president's got job approval numbers that aren't very good, is not incredibly popular everywhere, that can be problematic, and that's the wave. But on the other hand, there was a wall, sort of structural barriers that would help at least partially mitigate that wave. And in the U.S. House of Representatives and state legislative races in a lot of states, that wall was district lines. That when Democrats lost, when Republicans gained so many governorships back in 2010, you set up Republicans to be in a position to draw favorable maps. I think it was 199 congressional districts, and Republicans were given the chance to do to Democrats what Democrats had done to Republicans for so many years in terms of maps. Not in every state. I live in Maryland now, Illinois. Both of those states had Democratic gerrymanders, but there were only about 40 districts in the country that were in states that Democrats truly gerrymandered versus 199 in 16 states that Republicans were able to do that. So these lines were able to sort of mitigate the damage to a certain extent and protect Republicans. And in the Senate, and I'm going to talk about this more in a second, it was which states were having U.S. Senate races that acted as sort of a barrier that helped protect Republicans. So it was going to be the wave versus the wall. The other metaphor I used was, with apologies to Charles Dickens, was a tale of two elections. That you really had two different elections taking place, or like an election that was taking place in two different countries this year. And one set of elections was for the U.S. Senate. And as it worked out, of the 13 most competitive races for the U.S. Senate in the country, the top 13, 10 of them were in states that President Trump carried back in 2016. Of the 17 Senate races where there was any doubt whatsoever about the outcome, 14 out of 17 were in states that President Trump carried. So these Senate races were disproportionately being fought in places where President Trump, in most of these cases, was actually very, very popular. And you noticed in the last 2 months before the election, and President Trump doesn't always do what sort of experts tell him to do, but they were very, very effective at sending him into the Senate race states more than the House, and into states where he could help. Because gosh knows there were plenty of suburban areas where a lot of the most competitive congressional districts where President Trump would have been a liability. So they sent him to where it mattered, but the U.S. Senate was being fought overwhelmingly in red Republican America and had one set of dynamics. Meanwhile, the House, state legislative, gubernatorial, other than, a lot of people forget that 3/4 of all of our governorships and 4/5 of all the state legislative seats in the country are up in the midterm election cycle, not in the presidential cycle. But a lot of these battlegrounds were in blue urban and purple suburban America, and that's the part of the country where, a little less so in the South, but where President Trump's numbers aren't good and where he really was something of a liability. So it really was two different elections, one side for the Senate and one side for everything else. More than any other election I ever saw, we had a discussion about intensity. And it goes to who votes who votes in these midterm elections. And Republican strategists were really, really worried this year because they saw Republican voters as complacent, as not really worked up, versus Democratic voters that tended to have a huge amount of intensity. Now, there is a natural tendency that happens that in the last month or two before an election, there's a tendency for partisans to come home. In other words, for Democrats to kind of gravitate back into the Democratic Party and Republicans to gravitate back into the Republican Party. That's perfectly normal. But the truth this cycle is that a lot of Democratic voters never left home. They've been agitated ever since November of 2016. So they had an intensity level from the very beginning that was very, very high, and Republican intensity was very, very low. And it got to the point where the Republican National Committee had conducted a national survey in the last few days of August, first couple of days of September. And that survey showed that most Republicans, most conservatives, most Trump voters didn't think their majority in the House was in danger. And as a result, they leaked the survey to Business Week that ran a piece of it because they were trying to wake up Republican voters that, hey, we've got a problem here. But a lot of Republicans didn't perceive there to be a problem. After all, the president had told them that there was going to be a red wave, not a blue wave. And we don't, people don't believe polls anyway. So there was a feeling of complacency. My favorite of all the national polls, and I'll talk about polling a little bit because, let me talk about it just for a second right now. The best pollsters in the business, Democrat, Republican, Independent, they are not as accurate as they were 20, 30, 40 years ago. And the reason for that, it's not intelligence or skill or anything. It's because of telemarketing and caller ID and voicemail. It is very, very hard to get a representative sample in a poll. And so no matter how good they are, it's troublesome, and we've been knowing this for 10 years, getting more and more, and online polling's not quite there yet. So we knew there was a growing problem, and you just sort of hope that the people that weren't responding in polls wouldn't be terribly different from the ones that were responding. But I oftentimes have people say, well, why should we listen to polls at all? They were so wrong back in 2016. Well, my response is, wait, excuse me, which polls are you talking about? And they say, well, the national polls. And I would say, well, what do national polls measure? They measure the national popular vote. That national polls don't attempt to say what's going to happen in Alabama or Louisiana or Rhode Island or Oregon or whatever. It's a national poll. That reflects the national popular vote. Well, what did the polls show going into Election Day? The polls, if you'd looked at Real Clear Politics average of all the major national polls going into Election Day in 2016, it showed that Hillary Clinton had a lead of 3 percentage points. And what happened? Well, she won the national popular vote by 2.1 percentage points. So they were 0.9 of a point off. Well, here's the dirty little secret. That's about as close as polls get. And that's actually closer than they had been back in 2012 when the national polls showed the Obama-Romney race closer than the 3-point margin that it ended up being. Now, I know that the national popular vote and $5 will get you a cup of coffee at Starbucks, because that's not how we decide who wins. And we obviously knew that the popular vote could go one way and the Electoral College could go another way. I mean, after all, that's what had happened back in 2000 when Al Gore won the popular vote and George W. Bush won the Electoral College vote. We knew that could go different directions. But the last time the national popular vote went this far one direction and the Electoral College went the other direction was 140 years earlier, 1876. We all fondly remember when Samuel Tilden won the popular vote and Rutherford B. Hayes by 3 points, and Rutherford B. Hayes won the Electoral College. So it just was pretty unlikely that there'd be that big of a spread. Ironically, this year, this cycle, the polls were actually quite good, and the national polls were dead on. I mean, they were showing Democrats ahead to average 7, 8 points, and, well, looks like it's 8 points. And in the special elections and most of the statewide, in fact, statewide races, there was not a surprise outcome in any U.S. Senate or governor's race in the country this year. That every seat, every statewide, or I can't speak to a Secretary of State race or something, but every gubernatorial and U.S. Senate race went that was expected to go Democratic did, and every one that was expected to go Republican did, and there's some that you knew were going to be close, and guess what? They were pretty close. So this time the polling was actually pretty good. But anyway, and now that I get back, you can tell I'm ADD. So those educators back at Captain Shreve really did have a challenge with me. But my favorite of all the national polls is the NBC Wall Street Journal poll, because what they've done for decades is they have one of the top Republican polling firms in the country together with one of the top Democratic firms, and they do the survey together. And in their polling in election years, what they ask is, they ask voters, on a scale of 1 to 10, how interested are you in the upcoming election? And from January through August, in the monthly polling for NBC and the Wall Street Journal, 63% of Democrats called themselves 9s or 10s, 63%. But only 51% of Republicans, January through August, called themselves 9s and 10s. So there was a 12-point intensity gap. That's the kind of thing that was scaring the heck out of the RNC folks. Now, some of this, the Democrats are already up here, some of that intensity would have picked up, would have closed up some over the course of September, October, and the first week of November. Some of it would. But Republicans were very, very, very nervous. And during when the next NBC Wall Street Journal poll was done in mid-September, it was right in the middle of the Kavanaugh fight. And the Kavanaugh Supreme Court fight, I call it a color enhancement event. Because what it did was it made the reds redder and the blues bluer. And it didn't really cause many people to change sides, to change teams, but it really brought more vividly the intensity, the polarization that was taking place. So that when NBC and the Wall Street Journal did their next poll in mid-September, the Democratic 9s and 10s went up 2 points, from 63 to 65, but the Republican number went up 10 points, from 51 to 61. So now there was, mid-September, a 4-point difference. When they did their next one in mid-October, after the Kavanaugh fight was over, Democrats had gone up another 7 points to 72, but Republicans went up by 7 points as well to 68. So there was still only a 4-point gap at that point. And then when they did their very last survey, in the first couple of days of November, the Democratic number had gone up by another 3 points to 73, but the Republican number had gone up 1 point from 72 to 73. The Republican number had gone up 4 points from 68 to 72. So it was 73-72, where the intensity for Republicans had basically caught up with the intensity of Democrats. So that was and some of it was natural, but some of it was Kavanaugh. Now, you might say, well, why was the national popular vote 8 percentage points and Republicans lose 40 seats in the House and all this? Why did that? Well, 2 things. Number one, there are a few more Democrats than Republicans on if you look at the national exit polls, 37% of all the voters considered themselves Democrats, and 95% of them voted Democratic. 33% called themselves Republicans, 94% of them voted Republican. And so they're just simply, the Democratic number was a little bit higher because they were working with a little bit larger base. But the other thing is what happened is among independents. Now, to go back to 2016, independent voters voted for President Trump over Hillary Clinton by a 4-point margin. Independent voters voted Republican for Congress nationally by a 6-point margin. But that was back in 2016. But this year, Democrats won the independent vote by 12 points, 54 to 42. And so you had, in the vote for Congress, you had an 18-point swing among independents. And that is what drove a good bit of sort of the national outcome, is that independents just simply cut against Republicans. Now in the Senate, Republicans they'd gone in with a 51-49 majority, which is, sounds pretty precarious, and it is kind of precarious, but we knew that this was the most favorable map for Republicans. It was the most favorable map that either party had had in really modern times. The Democrats had 26 seats up at risk and Republicans only had 9. So Democrats just had a lot more exposure. But if that sounds bad, actually it was really worse than that for Democrats, tougher for Democrats, because Democrats had 10 U.S. Senate seats up in states that President Trump won. There was only 1 Republican seat up in a state that Hillary Clinton won, Dean Heller out in Nevada. Now, if that sounds tough, it was actually worse than that, because Democrats had 5 U.S. Senate seats up in states that Trump carried by 19 points or more. And that Republicans ended up beating 3 out of 5 of them, picking up seats beating incumbents in North Dakota, Indiana, and Missouri. 2 of those Democrats managed to hold on, and then they won 1 more Democratic seat down in Florida, where Bill Nelson, the incumbent. Now, Florida is a state that Obama carried by 1 point, Trump carried it by 1 point. It's as competitive a state as there is, and a few of you may have met Bill Nelson, the Democratic incumbent. Really, really nice guy. But he was 70 years old and probably should have retired. And he had Rick Scott, the incumbent Republican governor, who you could agree or disagree or like or not like, but the guy's just an animal. I mean, I'd say that in a positive way. He is tenacious as hell and had $50 million of his own money to put in the race and just ate Nelson's lunch and upset him. And I think he, frankly, will be the most miserable. If you look at the U.S. Senate, the most miserable people in the U.S. Senate are always the former governors, because they've had real power as the chief executive of state, and then they join a debating society. Pretty frustrating. Anyway, I would expect Rick Scott to be absolutely miserable, but anyway, and then Democrats knocked off 2 Republican seats. Dean Heller, the 1 Republican that was up in a state that Clinton had carried, she had won it by 2 points, and then an open seat in Arizona, and this is one that really surprised me. You had a Democratic congresswoman and a Republican congresswoman running against each other, okay? Now, the Republican was a pretty centrist candidate. Martha McSally, she was the first woman combat fighter pilot in the U.S. Air Force. She flew A-10 Warthogs, which are these really ugly, slow planes that infantry people really like. Our older son served in Afghanistan with the 82nd Airborne, and he said those things came in and saved their rear ends many, many, many times. But anyway, she's a fairly centrist Republican. But she, and the Democrat was really, really, really liberal, Kristen Sinema. Well, the thing is, the Democrat ran to the middle and ran as a centrist. The Republican was a centrist, but ran like a nut and lost. And it's like, hello, what are you doing? This is a state that's getting less Republican and getting more competitive. Anyway, somebody's going to have to explain to me what in the hell they were doing. But anyway, now in the House, as I said, Democrats lost 40 seats unless the one in North Carolina flips over, and I don't know what the hell's going to happen there. But it looks like 40 seats, and where Republicans lost ground, where they lost ground, was basically in suburban districts, districts with large suburban and urban populations. And what was interesting is the tipping point in these House races seemed to be 7 percentage points. Of the district, there were 435 districts, and 218 is majority. Of the 109, President Trump had won 199 districts by 7 points or more, 199. And Republicans this year won 191 out of 199 that he had carried by 7 points or more. In other words, Republicans won 96% of the districts that he won by 7 percentage points or more. But of the districts that he either lost or won by less than 7 percentage points, Democrats won 226 out of 236. Democrats won 96% of those. So there seemed to be about a 7-point swing that was out there. And population density has become a pretty big marker out there. And I'm not going to bury you in a lot of numbers, but just a couple of them. And that there is, we've been talking about a gender gap in this country ever since, I can remember, ever since President Reagan's first term. But in this one, men voted Republican by a 4-point margin nationwide. Women voted Democratic by a 19-point margin. White men voted Republican by a 21-point margin. White women split evenly, 49-49. Now that's really unusual because Republicans usually, they win among white women, not as big as among men, but they usually win there. For it to be a draw, that's a real problem, and particularly when you factor in that African Americans were going Democratic by an 81-point margin, Latinos by a 54-point margin, and Asian Americans by a 12-point margin. But the other big gap that's occurring is, and maybe in the Deep South is probably a little less than as a nation as a whole, but white college graduates voted Democratic by a 8-point margin, but non-college degree, whites with less than a 4-year college degree voted Republican by a 27-point margin. So a 35-point difference based on whether you have a 4-year college degree or not. White college educated women voted Democratic by a 20-point margin, but non-college graduate women voted Republican, white women, these are whites, by a 14-point margin, so a 34-point split. Wow, that's really, really something. And among white men, college grads, they voted Republican by a 4-point margin. Non-college white men voted Republican by a 34-point margin. So a 30-point gap between the two. The final set of numbers I'll throw at you is age. And this is something that Republicans, you know, after Mitt Romney lost in 2012, the Republican National Committee commissioned what people nicknamed an autopsy, what went wrong. And it was a very, very, very good report about where the Republican Party, what they need to be doing. Now, they ignored most of it, but anyway. But among voters, all voters, 45 to 64 years of age, they voted Republican by a 1-point margin. Of voters 65 years of age and older, they voted Republican by a 2-point margin. But what about 18 to 29-year-olds? They voted Democratic by a 35-point margin, and 30 to 44-year-olds voted by a 19-point margin. So what I'm getting at is, I graduated from high school in 1972. That was the first year I was able to vote. Of the voters that were born 72 earlier, Republicans basically, broke even, won by a little bit. But of the ones born after 1972, got destroyed, just destroyed. And Republicans need to be thinking about that as they look down the road, is they better start connecting with younger voters, because those of us who are on the shady side of, well, whatever the other side, I just turned 65, I'm told there's some attrition that occurs among us. And they need to kind of worry a little bit about that. Okay, now real quickly, well, hell, I always just skip forward to 2020. I'm not positive President Trump's going to run, but he probably will. I mean, he's a very, I'm not sure this is the job he expected it to be. I think that the president probably expected this job to be 2/3 ceremonial and fun, and 1/3 autocratic and fun. And instead, the fun quotient's a lot less, and this stuff's a lot more complicated than it looked like. But he's a very competitive guy. And I don't think his DNA would allow him to run from a fight. But at the same time, I don't think he's someone that would ever want to have a L on his forehead as a loser either. And so watching where the economy's going, and there's some very troubling signs out there, there's some chance that he doesn't run, but my assumption is that he probably will. Now, why do incumbent presidents lose re-election? And this is interesting because in the post-World War II era, we've had 8 presidents that were elected and then ran for re-election, 8. 6 out of 8 of them were re-elected, 6 out of 8. And who were the 2 elected presidents who didn't get re-elected? Well, number one was Jimmy Carter in 1980, and the other was President George H.W. Bush in 1992. Now, what did they have in common? One thing they had in common was President Carter had a challenge from the left from Senator Edward Kennedy for the nomination. President Bush had a challenge from the right from Pat Buchanan, who didn't beat him in New Hampshire but ran pretty close to him in New Hampshire. Now, you could argue, were these presidents so vulnerable that they were not able to prevent a nomination challenge, or were the nomination challenges damaging, weakening them, and divided their parties and led to their losses? Now, there's one other thing, though, that kind of comes into play, and that is that when there are third-party candidates, independent third-party candidates in there, it tends to work against whichever party occupies the White House. And George Wallace in 1968, intellectually, I would say it would hurt Republicans, but when you look at sort of where Democrats had traditionally done pretty well, it seemed to have worked against, it may have contributed to Humphrey's loss. 1980, John Anderson running, Carter lost. 1992, Ross Perot running, President Bush lost. Now, whether it was a major factor or not, don't know, but those are sort of the 2 common threads between those 2. Now, can President Trump, people ask, well, is anybody going to beat him for the nomination? Is he going to get challenged? Well, in the 20 months, look, if somebody wants to tell me that President Trump is reelected, I can believe that. If somebody wants to tell me that he runs for re-election and loses a general election, I can believe that. If somebody even wants to tell me that he doesn't run, I can believe that. The one thing I have a really, really hard time seeing is him lose a nomination. In the 20 months of his presidency, Gallup polls every single week, President Trump's lowest job approval rating among Republicans, lowest ebb, was 77%. Highest was 91%. It's usually in the high 80s. And when CNN did a survey recently, they asked Republicans and independents that lean Republican whether they favored renominating President Trump. 74% said yes, which was basically almost the same as the 75% at that point that said that about asked Democrats about renominating Obama at this point in his term. And to be perfectly, now, will somebody run against him? Maybe, but think about how little tolerance there is for dissent within the Republican Party. Senator Jeff Flake of Arizona wrote a book that came out last year that was highly critical of President Trump. That book amounted to a 160-page political suicide note, because after it came out, he could not have won renomination in Arizona and decided to retire. Senator Bob Corker from Tennessee, he didn't even write a book. He just said some things critical. And but before it was all over with, he wouldn't have won a Republican nomination in Tennessee. Congressman Mark Sanford in South Carolina made some critical remarks, and the president tweeted against him, and he lost his primary to a Tea Party candidate who subsequently lost a general election in a district that I wouldn't have thought a Republican could lose. The thing about it is somebody may run against him for the nomination, but frankly, I think dental records will be of little use in identifying the corpse of whoever runs against him for the Republican nomination. And if somebody out of the Republican side, like a Kasich or something, wants to run as an independent, so people say, well, could they be successful? Well, they could be successful at being a spoiler, but probably not much more than that. So let's just go ahead to the general election real quick, because I know you guys need to be out of here by 1:30. I'd like to leave some time for questions, comments, or accusations. There was a book that came out first about 20 years ago by a historian from American University, Alan Lichtman. It was called The Keys to the Presidency. And he identified 13 questions, sort of yes, no, that if you knew the answers to these 13 questions, you could accurately predict which side was going to win a presidential race. Now, where I disagree with Alan, I've known him a long time, is these things are, did the president's party have a nomination challenge? Do they have an incumbent? Is there a major third-party candidate? The short-term economy, the long-term economy, major policy change, social unrest, scandal, foreign policy or military success, foreign policy or military failure, incumbent charisma, challenger charisma. Now, Lichtman paints these as all objective questions, but when I look at it, some of them are fairly subjective, like what's charisma? What's success? What's failure? What's major policy change? But it does drive that fundamentals really do matter. And when people ask me, well, can President Trump, will he be reelected? The first thing I ask is, well, before we talk about 2020, what was 2016 about? And the thing is that in that weird split decision election, certain extent it was certainly about Donald Trump. I mean, that for someone who is the son of a real estate multimillionaire, became a billionaire, lived up on the 67th or 8th or 9th floor, whatever, of Trump Tower, he did have an ability to sort of look inside a lot of Southern heartland voters, small town, rural, manufacturing workers, working class people, and connect with them in a way that you wouldn't have thought necessarily that someone who had lived in New York his whole life, or virtually his whole life, would have been able to do. So certainly he was a piece of it. But I would argue a big piece of it was Hillary Clinton. And that, both Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton had picked up a lot of baggage since they burst on the national stage in 1991, 92, a lot of baggage. But at least until the Me Too movement came along, it seemed that President Clinton almost had a Teflon coating, that things just didn't stick to him so much. Meanwhile, Hillary Clinton, it was almost like she had Velcro, that stuff just stuck to her in a way that it didn't stick to him. And maybe it was sexism, whatever it is, it definitely was there. And the other thing is that Hillary Clinton always had a hard time projecting warmth. And the one time I had a long conversation with her, it was when she was in the Senate. I found her very warm and engaging, but I will tell you, I never once saw that person on television, and I never once saw that person in front of a large room. That I think that when her husband was criticized, it was like water off a duck's back with him. But for her, I think Hillary Clinton had built this protective shell, like an armadillo shell, that would be as a protective mechanism. And yeah, maybe it did protect her, but it kept people from feeling close. The pollster Peter Hart did a series of focus groups, and he said, that more than a glass ceiling, Hillary Clinton had almost a glass wall that prevented people from feeling close to her. And so I think there was a certain amount of that there. Now, she made some mistakes. I mean, just imagine if, as the brand new Secretary of State, she says in a staff meeting, I'm thinking about that we should get a private email server. And if a staff member had said, that's probably a bad idea. And if she had said, oh, okay, then I won't. Hell, she could be President of the United States right now. Or the word deplorable. I think it was probably good for 78,000 votes spread across Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And her campaign made big mistakes. Having her as the first Democratic or Republican nominee since 1972 to not step foot in the state of Wisconsin between Labor Day and Election Day, I think that was a mistake. Being the first president, they didn't do any polling in individual states, like normal telephone polls. They didn't do any in individual states in the last 3 weeks before the election. So that if they had, maybe they would have realized that suddenly they had a problem in Michigan, in Illinois, Michigan and Wisconsin. Or the decision, you know what, we don't have to persuade anybody. We just need to get our vote out. And so in Pennsylvania, for example, as long as we get our vote out in Philadelphia and in Montgomery, Bucks, Delaware, Chester counties, the suburban counties, in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County out west, we don't have to worry about people in between. We don't have to persuade anybody. Now, the famous political philosopher, James Carville, once said about Pennsylvania that it was Philadelphia in the east, Pittsburgh in the west, and Alabama in between. And the thing about it is, you look at the central and across the top, that state's real, it's real conservative. They didn't film the deer hunter there for nothing. It was, so the thing about it is her campaign made some real mistakes. But how much of that was him? How much of it was her? How much was unique to the Democratic Party? Good question. But one thing that Republicans have to kind of wonder about is, okay, what were the 3 states that made the difference that they won by a total of 78,000? Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. Wisconsin, the incumbent Republican governor, Scott Walker, just lost re-election, and a fairly liberal Democrat senator got re-elected. Michigan, Republicans just lost the governorship that they'd had for a while, and a Democratic senator was re-elected relatively easily. Pennsylvania, the governor and the senator, Democratic governor, Democratic senator, re-elected. So it makes you kind of wonder whether whatever the problems were back in 2016 for Democrats, maybe they still exist, but they might not be as big as they were then, maybe. So we have to kind of wait and see. The final point I wanted to make is this. When people say, well, is President Trump, can Democrats beat President Trump? And my response is, it reminds me of the old joke about the woman who was asked by a friend, how's your husband? And she replied, compared to what? And I think that's pretty. Now, the older people here actually know the original joke that I'm not doing. But anyway, now, there are going to be things like ideology. If this is the American political spectrum, and here's the Democratic Party, and I'm getting the hook here. Here's the Democratic Party, and let's just say Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, where John Kerry was, is sort of here left of center, and over here's Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Where's the center of gravity in the Democratic Party right now? Well, it's to the left of Joe and Hillary and John, and it's not quite over to Bernie and Elizabeth, but it's headed that general direction. Now, if I were Democrats, is that what I would do? No. And will they continue? We don't know. Then we know that electability is not usually a major factor for people when they decide who to support for their party's nomination. We know that. But I was talking to a Democratic pollster, and I was saying this, and he said, yeah, but what about unelectability? And when you talk to Democrats, when you talk to liberals, the 2 most horrible things that could possibly happen in the year 2020 to most liberals and most Democrats would be, 1, a giant asteroid hits the earth and kills us all, and the second one would be President Trump's reelected. And so if electability is not a major factor, what about unelectability? This pollster suggested, where if someone says, I really like so-and-so, they're my first choice, but I'm not sure he or she could win. But my second choice or my third choice might have a better chance. So does that factor in? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I think we're going to have a Democratic field that's going to be at least as big as the 17 Republicans that ran last time, and this thing could head north of 25 or 30. And it's going to have all the diversity that you saw of people getting elected in this last Congress. I mean, we've had women run for president before, but we're going to have 2, 3, 4, 5 high-profile women running. We've had African Americans run before. We're going to have 2, 3, 4 running there. We've got, you know, old white guys and younger white guys, and I mean, I've got a list of like 28 people on the list. Now, some of them are probably better ideas than others, and the question is, you know, what do Democrats want? Do they want a rebel? Do they want their own version of Donald Trump? Or do they want sort of a return to normalcy, a more conventional candidate? Don't know what they're going to do, but the warning sign is this. You know, President Trump has never seen, he got 46% of the vote, and at no point has he had a weekly Gallup job approval rating above 45%. And when you look at the polling, and let me just use Fox News, it's typical of the others, that ask approve, disapprove, but then they ask strong somewhat. 31% strongly approve the job President Trump's doing, another 16% somewhat, 8% somewhat disapprove, 43% strongly disapprove. And you look across all the major polls that do it that way, for every one person that strongly approves, there's 1.4, 1.5 that strongly disapprove. There's an intensity there, and that's why I kind of wonder about his strategy of basically doubling down on the people that did vote for him and not trying to expand the base. Maybe it'll work for him a second time. He proved all the experts wrong before, but boy, that seems to be a pretty dangerous strategy, but we'll see. And are Democrats capable of screwing this up? Hell yes. But we'll have to see. Boss, do we have any time for questions? We have time for 2 questions, comments, or accusations. Just wave your arms in a non-threatening fashion. Yes, sir.
Thanks for one of the 2. Tell us about ballot harvesting.
Ballot
harvesting.
Ballot harvesting. I will confess, I never heard that term until this year. And there's a interesting situation in North Carolina, and you know, we haven't gotten to the bottom of it yet, and I'm sure it's probably not the first time it's ever happened, but people going out and collecting absentee ballots, and maybe the ones that were for the side they wanted got turned in, and maybe the ones that didn't may have fallen into a trash can someplace. Maybe, maybe not, we don't know. I never heard this phrase before. I do think that in this hyper partisan environment that we've had increasing the last 10, 20, 30 years, we are seeing very aggressive behavior coming out in this, and some really troubling things happening, and ones that I just kind of wonder, are we going down this road of American politics just going to a really bad place where there are just no restraints whatsoever? Or will people want to move more towards, somebody said sanity, you know, just sort of more, I don't know, but we're seeing some really aggressive behavior here, and very troubling. And I have to say, I mean, I personally don't think, and I'm talking about both parties, I don't think voter fraud has been a major problem in this country for the last 20, 30 years. When you look at the infinitesimal number of voter fraud cases that President George W. Bush's Justice Department found during the 8 years they were in office, and they looked. it was a negligible proportion. But I think there are a whole lot of people that think it's a big problem, and particularly Republicans and conservatives that believe that voter fraud is a massive problem. And this one North Carolina case happens to be one where it seems like Republicans are accused of having done this, or at least a couple people are. So I don't know, but I'm really distressed at the hyper-partisanness and this lack of restraint that we're seeing, that past behavior just pales in comparison. One last one before I get the hook. Anybody going once, twice? Yes, sir. How much weight have I lost? I have lost 100 pounds in the last year and a half, and someone said, how'd you do it? Well, the last time I weighed 165 pounds, I'll put it in the perspective that I understand. It was the first half of President Reagan's first term. And someone said, what's the secret? And say, well, have your cardiologist scare the you-know-what out of you with your wife sitting there. And so you get gastric bypass, and there you go. But anyway, I told my wife, I hope you like me. I'm going to be around a lot longer than she'd bargained for. But anyway, this is a great skate. Thank you, CABL, for everything you do for the state. And congratulations, Governor Blanco.
Support provided by Walters, Papillon, Thomas Cullens, LLC, specializing in business litigation and personal injury cases for over 40 years.